has to be clear. Roles and responsibilities have to be clear. Communication has to be clear and consistent and frequent and often. And that's the only way that you get this accountability and responsibility to work well. You have to have that authority in there, interplay between all of those things.
Responsibilities keep the machine running. Accountabilities make sure the machine is heading in the right direction and is in alignment with those outcomes. And both matter, but without accountability, responsibilities can become motion without progress.
You need to hold those people accountable. Hold your team members accountable. It sounds like a weapon instead of a tool. But the fact is, accountability is a tool for success, and it's something that should be used in that way.
Not only do we have to designate responsibility, we also need to empower them. And then when they make their decisions, the property, customer, the public will provide feedback until accountability ends up being invisible. And what we need to do just happens. Are you tired of doing the same thing in repeating situations which end up with the same result? Maybe it's time for a new perspective. This is Viewpoints on the Multifamily Media Network. Our hosts discuss a topic from different angles and provide actionable ideas. Maybe a new view would change the outcome. Welcome to MMN Viewpoints.
Welcome back to another Viewpoint. My name is Mike Brewer. I am the Chief Operating Officer at Axia Residential based in Atlanta, Georgia. We also have a parent company, ARC Multifamily Group, based in Irvine, California. This month's Viewpoint is on the topic of accountability and responsibility. Now, I want to add something. This was not part of the script, but I want to add something. I don't think accountability and responsibility work without authority. And the definition of authority is really the right and the power to command or make a decision or assign a task to, in other words, delegate. And then you have responsibility. So because we're given definitions of terms, responsibility is really your obligation to fulfill a task or to complete something that has been assigned to you. I like to tear that word apart sometimes and say your ability to respond. Responsibility is your ability to respond. I also like to think about a book that Viktor Frankl wrote called A Man's Search for Meaning. And in there, he creates this concept, or he communicates this concept called space between catalyst and response. And that space between is defined as choice. So if you have something that happens in your environment, you have a choice to make right here. It could be a long bit of time to make that choice, or it could be something that has to be made in a snap. So catalyst, response ability or ability to respond, and then you have an outcome. So think about that. Pick up that book. It's fantastic. So that's the definition of responsibility. And then accountability is your obligation to answer for your actions or answer for the decisions that you make or the work that you performed. So if somebody in authority assigns something to you, you have responsibilities, right, to choose to do that thing and to do it well. And then you have accountability in that you have to answer for that particular thing that you did. Now, all these things have sort of an interplay. So when authority is delegated, your responsibilities are assigned, whether they be to you, to others. And then out through that delegation, there's this accountability. You have to balance those things. There has to be fantastic, clearly defined roles so that we know who's responsible, we know who's accountable, we know who the authority is. Clear communication. I like to think about it. I like to say that you are only starting to communicate when you get sick and tired of hearing yourself talk about the thing that you were trying to get accomplished. That's the beginning of communication. Until you're speaking so frequently and often that you get sick of hearing yourself saying the same thing over and over, that's when communication is actually starting. But anyway, it has to be clear. Roles and responsibilities have to be clear. Communication has to be clear and consistent and frequent and often. And that's the only way that you get this accountability and responsibility to work well. You have to have that authority in there and the interplay between all of those things. So that's my viewpoint for this month. Take care. We'll talk to you again soon.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Viewpoints, where Suzanne Hopson here with Multifamily Elevated. I was so excited about this topic. I had to jump in and share my 2 cents on the differences between accountabilities and responsibilities in multifamily leadership. So I'm just going to jump right in and ask you the question. Have you ever sat in a meeting where everybody's nodding, that they understand, and yet you know that everyone is not agreeing on everything, but nobody really says anything. And there seems to be the fact that the tasks may or may not get done, but the problem remains that there's usually some confusion between accountabilities and responsibilities. So you see, maybe 70% of people fulfilling their obligations, and the results they suffer, right? And a lot of that has to do with the natural confusion. It's not unusual to get responsibilities confused with accountability. So let's dive into some of those key differences, which I think will help all of us to remember what it means to own it versus, how do you do it? So let's just set the stage and also talk about how you'll be able to put this into action with your teams, which I think is also really important as leaders in multifamily. How do we really set the example and model this so that other people know how to do it? Quite frankly, it's not something that I think we're naturally born with. How do we really understand the differences between what we own and what we do? So responsibilities. I think this really equals the tasks, the duties, really the job description when we look at what a job description is. And so an example is a leasing consultant is responsible for giving tours, answering the phones, and entering leads into the CRM. But they're accountable for the outcomes, right? So they own the results. They own the conversion ratio, the turning the leads into leases. And really the key point on this is that responsibilities are, again, what you do, and accountabilities are what gets measured. So here's another one, and why that distinction really matters. If you're looking for clarity, which I think we all are in the chaos of multifamily, especially in busy leasing offices and maintenance shops, responsibilities pile up quickly. And without accountabilities, it becomes busy work with really no focus. So ownership versus blame is how I can really tell the difference between who's owning it and who's not. When teams only talk about responsibilities and the tasks, it becomes busy work with really no focus. When you are, owning the outcome, obviously that helps with that clarity. But let's just take a look at another example that I think we can all relate to. A maintenance tech, they may have responsibilities like work orders, turns, inspections, but they're accountable for the resident satisfaction scores a lot of the time, or the unit readiness, with a set time frame. So again, metrics, KPIs, measurement, that's what we're accountable for, right? I heard that a really long time ago from a mentor and friend, and he said it like this: what can we count on you for? Those are accountabilities. So, and also another way to look at it, and this is really from an owner's perspective, what impact are you going to have on performance? So owners and operators care about NOI, about occupancy, about renewals, about reputation. Those are accountabilities. The daily tasks are just the path to get there, if that makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about practical application at the property level. Property manager responsible again for reporting, scheduling, renewals, accountabilities for property occupancy, budget performance, just to name a few. Leasing team is responsible for the tours and follow-ups, and they're really accountable for those closing ratios, like we said before. Maintenance teams, again, work orders, work order completion, response time, resident satisfaction. And again, these vary depending on, the company, the property, what those accountabilities have been set to be. But at the regional level, for the regional manager, that may look like responsibility for site visits and for coaching. And the accountability is really the performance for their portfolio. So how do you really implement the difference here and into your own your site team, with your site team? And, you use accountability charts versus org charts, meaning you, instead of listing out the duties of that role, you're listing out the accountabilities on that accountability chart, that you put a metric to every seat. This is something I talk about all the time. What's your number? When people know their number, they're able to deliver on it much better with that clarity. And, when you ask somebody, like, how do you measure whether or not you're doing well in your seat? And if they can't tell you that, then there's ambiguity, there's some confusion. And that's where you can step in and really provide some clarity. So the conversation can really be had in your one-to-ones. I highly recommend quarterly conversations because that's a really great time to touch point, not just at the review, the annual review or the half year mark. And you're talking about not just whether tasks were checked off, but what are the results of what they're doing? And how are they viewing those results? Are they owning it or are they blaming? It was somebody else's fault. Yeah. So the leadership takeaways really is just stop overloading those job descriptions with, the responsible language. Get sharper and define the outcomes so that people know what the targets are. What do you really expect at the end of the day? People can do tasks, but can they deliver on those results? Making it clear helps them tremendously with that pathway. And make accountability visible. So dashboards and scorecards are really helpful visuals for people to know whether they're on or they're off. And even a whiteboard in a leasing office, whatever those visuals are that work for your team specifically, or even an individual team member, use them. They're really, really impactful. And, train your team to own the outcomes, not just do their part, because the outcome creates group accountability. It's not just one thing to deliver on your accountabilities. What's the accountability for the end result for the property? When you see group accountability where your peers are holding people accountable, it's so powerful. And as a leader, it really helps relieve you from being the bad guy all the time. And accountability really shouldn't be a bad thing. It is really about, how can I help you if you're off target? What can we do to help this team member get back on track? That kind of feedback and conversation is much more healthy than, you didn't get the results. So what's up? So, challenge to you as someone that's listening right now to all of the input that you'll hear, which is all expert input from our group at MMN. Responsibilities keep the machine running. Accountabilities make sure the machine is really heading in the right direction and is in alignment with those outcomes. And both matter, but without accountability, responsibilities can become motion without progress. And that's not what we're shooting for here. So this week, look at your own role, look at your team's role, and ask, are we just doing the tasks? Or do we know what, who and what those outcomes are? Who owns them and what are they? The shift could really change everything in how your property and your portfolio performs. And we know this, that when people are winning, life is just so much easier. So, getting those results is the end prize for many reasons. Not only is it great for your bottom line, but it's great for your soul. So thanks for joining me and sharing in the time with me on Viewpoints. And you'll be gathering lots of great info as my friends share more with you on the topic.
So what do you think of when you hear somebody say, you need to hold that person accountable? Does it say, wow, we can help that human do better? Or does it sound like a witch hunt? I'm Mary Gwyn, host of PX Multifamily, the People Experience podcast. Stick with me for the next few minutes as I share my viewpoint on Multifamily Media Network's Viewpoint series. Well, when I hear some people use the word accountability or say things like, you need to hold those people accountable, hold your team members accountable, it sounds like a weapon instead of a tool. But the fact is, accountability is a tool for success, and it's something that should be used in that way. We recently had an employee go rogue, go just like off the rails. He's been with us for almost 13 years, and it was kind of a heartbreak. But over the last year and a half, things were sliding a little bit at the property. Little shifts in KPIs that should have flagged for us that things weren't going great, but they were so subtle, and we trusted him because he's been with us so long. And the manager didn't really point anything out. In fact, his manager knew things were going off the rails. And because she assumed, oh, well, he's been with the company for almost 13 years, he's a sacred cow, she didn't take the action she would normally have taken with other team members. When he was coming in later and later and not turning in service requests and not doing all the things, she didn't say anything to him or to her regional or to us. And when he wasn't getting units turned well or timely or turning in his receipts and things like that, she didn't really say much until it got way out of hand and it was starting to impact occupancy and other things. And he was disappearing for hours at a time and not reporting in as required. And at that point, we did know there was a problem. So we tried to do a major reset. We had the regional and me and other people meet together and try to just reset expectations and talk about solutions to the problems. But what we didn't realize was by then it was too late. Whatever had gone wrong, it was just too far gone. Well, was it the manager's fault that the team member failed? Absolutely not. But could she have possibly headed off the failure by holding him accountable all along? I think so. Everybody needs accountability. Everybody reports to somebody. I own my own business and I have different people say, oh, you own your own business. You get to work for yourself. Well, I'm still accountable. In fact, my team members, our clients, but even my team members, they expect things of me. They expect and need me to follow through on my responsibilities and my obligations. And if I don't do them, I let the team down. And by the way, my team will nudge me respectfully, of course, and they should. They probably give me a little too much grace, but ultimately, we all work together as a team. So when someone says, hold your team accountable, it shouldn't be a weapon. It should be holding team members all together and making sure we're all doing our part to produce the results. Holding people accountable should surely be something we just do as part of our day-to-day. Like I said, everybody reports to somebody. And I say that especially for people who own your own business. I report to somebody all day, every day. So hold your team members accountable for results, not as a weapon, not as they're failing, but to give ongoing feedback, coaching, correcting, all those things. It can be a real differentiator in keeping a good employee good or seeing a slow, slippery slide that leads to their demise. So what's your viewpoint on this important topic? Please comment, like, share, all of the things.
When you hear the word accountability, what's your response? I mean, not just your real quick word response or anything like that. In your gut, what do you feel when you hear the word accountability? I'm Paul Rhodes, host of the Maintenance Mindset Podcast. And this month on Viewpoints, responsibility and accountability is our topic. And I really like this format to be able to discuss it because in addition to getting it from normal business leaders, we're able to talk about topics that are not brought up from a viewpoint that's frequently not included in corporate circles. And that is maintenance and accountability. You see, it's my premise and it's my firm belief that the best accountability is invisible. And my justification for that thought is just this. When was the last time you held somebody accountable for success? In other words, have you at your community ever mentioned specifically to your maintenance professional, great job on that work order that took us multiple days to complete and we received 0 callbacks? Or the move-in that happened and the resident was overjoyed at the condition of the apartment. Does that information reach back to your maintenance technician? You see, those are examples of areas where our maintenance team needs to be held accountable for the success, not just the failure. See, according to Webster's dictionary online, the word accountability says the fact or condition of being accountable. I think that's kind of a cop-out because there you're using the word accountable in the definition of accountability. When pressed a little bit further, it went on to say that holding someone responsible. That's actually where my premise for invisibility and accountability being synonyms are the best way to go. You see, our maintenance operations need to be spelled out so that everyone involved knows what their responsibility is. A couple of years ago, I was asked to present at a national conference about make-readies and how our maintenance teams could do better on make-readies, how we could shorten the time to ready of our vacant apartments right after a resident moved out. And I began asking them questions, specifically what they wanted out of it. And the conversation began, could you teach our maintenance technicians better ways of doing what they need to do faster? And I asked them back, what is the goal of faster? Do you want them to do the same things faster? No, they just said, we want them to get faster. Okay, are you happy with the performance that they're obtaining? Yeah, we're happy with the condition of the apartments that we're receiving, but they just need to get faster. And I said, okay, could you bring me some examples of what you're looking for so I could identify specific areas where I could provide enlightenment or come up with a better process? And these several different management companies brought examples of what they were looking for. And the unique thing that I found when we were looking and going over the data was that there were gaps in between when the resident moved out, handed it off to the office, who had to go through and inspect and do the SOTA or the end of month accounting, who would hand it off then to the maintenance team, who would hand it off to their vendors that they were going to use, the painter, cleaner, flooring, counters, whatever it was that they were doing in there. And then there was a gap between when it was going to hand off from there to the maintenance team. And then there was a gap for when a final inspection was going to be done. And at each and every one of these in the middle points, there was no overriding responsibility to keep the process moving. And I talked with these leaders of several different management companies and pointed out who owns this process at your communities, who is responsible for it. In other words, when it's done correctly, who do you go back to and pat on the back and say, you did a great job? When something fails in the process, who is it that we bring up the failure to correct whatever it was that failed? Because in both of those cases, that's accountability. Those leaders came back and they said, well, it depends. And in my mind, we're talking about one process, the make-ready process, getting the apartments ready. I said, until you can answer that question definitively, or you tell me the differences for why it has to be this person, singular person, or another person, singular person, you're never going to get any faster while maintaining the same level of proficiency. We ended up coming up with a ownership accountability structure. It's one I happen to believe in the fact that when the resident moves out, maintenance owns the apartment. If the office needs to inspect, they talk with the maintenance supervisor or manager or leader and be sure that they have it scheduled and everybody understands what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. But there's one person to go to in that point. Now, the communication, that will end up vary whether you're using a property management system or a messaging or you have a whiteboard. Please move away from the whiteboard. Let's get digital. I mean, we're in 2025 here. But each and every one of those pieces are just to document responsibility. In my mind, those pieces are tools. That does not maintain something that you can hold accountable. Accountable is a person, and that person is best when it's invisible, meaning it just functions. If something is not functioning, we go to that person who has a responsibility and come up with a solution together, and then it's that person's responsibility to ensure that it happens. If it happens correctly, then that responsible person gets the credit. That's why I really think in the make-ready process that we're talking about, it's a good idea for your maintenance supervisor, your maintenance team to meet your brand new resident the day of move-in. That way, your brand new resident knows who's responsible for the excellent condition that the apartment is in. Oh, one other thing, that implies that the person who's responsible to set the standards for the property, that person needs to be there as well. Because if we miss the standards, then the person who did the work is actually not the person to be held accountable for the miss. That should be our leader, the person most accountable for the responsibility of getting that apartment ready. You see, the concept behind invisible accountability comes down to the fact that if it works, we're not looking for somebody to hold accountable because we generally just expect it. It's when people go above and beyond that we need to call them out and give them credit. So my question for you, if maintenance is a controllable expense, and I firmly believe it is, if it is a controllable expense, who's accountable for the decision-making of that expense? Who's controlling the expense? And is that person who's controlling the expense empowered to make the decisions for what we need to have happen at our property happen? So that means not only do we have to designate responsibility, we also need to empower them. And then when they make their decisions, the property, customer, the public will provide feedback until accountability ends up being invisible and what we need to do just happens. One last thought where accountability and responsibility come into play. If your management company, if your organization, if your property is looking to continue to add more and more checklists, meaning workflows and various check-off points, so that you can disperse that accountability farther away, be sure that the message is reinforced at all levels, that the important thing is that whatever we're documenting happens, not the documentation taking more importance than the thing we need to have happen. Because at the end of the day, a checklist is just a piece of paper or a drop-down checkbox in an app. The best accountability is invisible because it's seamless and it just happens. That occurs when we have the best person leading whatever the effort is and just making it happen. Thank you for spending your time with me today. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week, and I'll see you somewhere. Before you leave this episode, answer these questions for an action plan based on the perspectives you've heard today. First, what idea caught my attention? Second, what was identified as something that I need to discontinue? The answers noted are a place to start for improved success. To go deeper, check out the shows by hosts you've heard from today. Thank you for being open to different viewpoints. This has been a Multifamily Media Network production.